IGN posted a video describing how, actually somewhat interesting sentiment, which is that of all the consoles available on the market today, weirdly enough, the definitive console is not even like the PlayStation 5 Pro or the $800 Xbox Series X 2 terabyte or whatever. It's not the most powerful device on the market. It's actually the PS5 base console, which is echoed in a lot of the things we've seen, where a lot of the advertising materials and things have actually been centered around base PS5 footage and capture, which I think is actually true. I think a lot of the games and trailers we've seen have been recorded on base PS5s, which is very interesting. A lot of games are also not seeing optimization for PS5 Pro either, which was something we saw all over the place with the PS4 Pro, was optimizations, PS4 Pro enhanced and stuff like that. That's been a much less common thing with the PS5 Pro, except from first party stuff like Ghost of Yotei. So I thought this was interesting. So we're going to check it out, see what IGN has to say about the console war. As you can see, GTA 6 and The Witcher 4 prove the console wars are over and the base PS5 won. Let's see what they have to say.
On PS5, captured on PS5, captured on PS5. Nah, I don't believe it. The PS5 is rubbish compared to my uncle's Pentium 12 PC that's not even out yet because he works for the NSA. Meanwhile, in the real world, there's a lot of good reasons why the makers of an upcoming game may want to reassure you that their product works on a good piece of hardware you probably have, rather than showing it at its best on a better piece of hardware that you statistically probably don't. Obviously, it's all about the lowest common denominator. No disrespect to the PS5 Pro, but significantly more people own a standard PS5 and are unlikely to bother upgrading until PS6 shows up because the economy's in the toilet, and with the best will in the world, a few extra blades of grass in Horizon Forbidden West is scarcely worth the upgrade to most people. Despite that, it does seem to fly in the face of common wisdom to not showcase games in their best possible state. I mean, Microsoft aren't making Xbox trailers on the Series S, are they? Granted, they're not making anything at the moment apart from people redundant. But if you wanted the most pristine, the most detailed, the most impressive PlayStation footage available, you'd capture from a PS5 Pro. Clearly,
You would think. I do find it really interesting that the PS5 Pro has not been at the centerpiece of a lot of this marketing, because it was one of the things that they did in the PS4 era, was when they started releasing games like that 2018, 19, 2020 period especially. Everything was showcased with PS4 Pro footage. And the way that that console worked was a good bit different. Like, it was all about checkerboarded 4K upscaling, which was like very complicated and didn't make a lot of sense. But they basically go from frame n to n+1, and they're rendering basically a checkerboarded pattern of the resolution, but then they can interpret and resolve a higher resolution frame, having only rendered in like very simple terms every other pixel, right? Like, so they can use this technique to get higher resolutions with less overall compute demand. It's not as accurate, of course, as actually just rendering natively, or they would argue nowadays using like a high quality upscaler rendering at a native lower resolution. But they used all sorts of techniques to achieve this higher end fidelity. And what it basically allowed them to do was to put out a trailer in 4K, but it just say, you know, PS4 Pro enhanced or whatever. And it was very easy to scale up for PS4 Pro compared to like PS5 Pro implementations, because PS5 Pro requires like the pisser tech to be implemented with the higher end upscaler, and even then in some games it can make it look worse, which is what we saw with, was it Silent Hill F? I think it actually looked worse on PS5 Pro, where it like added ghosting effects. Was that the game that had it? It's been a consistent problem actually with some games. It's that they look worse on the best hardware on the market, which is bizarre, but that's just where we are, I guess. So I just, but either way, I find it interesting that it's not been a bigger focus for PlayStation. And I do wonder if it's in part because like the PS4 or PS5 Pro has not sold as well as they thought. But I don't know. PS5 Pro sales numbers, I don't actually know. Let's see what they say. Eurogamer wrote an article about it. PS5 Pro sales fall behind PS4 Pro's pace in the US. It's double-digit percentage declines across all major consoles. That was according to industry analyst Matt Piscatella, who used Circana data to conclude that whilst the PS5 Pro enjoyed a solid start, January 2025's hardware spend in the US was 45% lower compared to the same period a year ago. In fact, Piscatella posits that there was, quote, double-digit percentage declines across all major platforms, console platforms, compared to a year ago, with PS5 hardware spend dipping by 38% year on year, Xbox Series declining by 50%, and Switch by 53%. But of course, they were waiting for the Switch too. And then Sony confirmed previously that sales of its PS5 Pro or PS5 console reached 75 million units, which was just shy of PS4 sales after the equivalent period. So if the PS5 Pro is lagging a little bit, not necessarily just because of the console itself, but also macroeconomic factors, you know, people don't have a lot of money to spend on smaller incremental upgrades, which certainly is a concern. Like right now, if you have a PS5, you can upgrade to the PS5 Pro, and like some games might look a tad better, some might look worse, but like who's really going to say that there's a big leap? There really is not. Whereas with the PS4, going from the PS4 Slim to the PS4 Pro, I remember there being a pretty significant step. And the other component was the original PS4. If you remember the big chonker, like the OG, that thing was so freaking loud. Do you remember the original PS4? This thing sounded like a jet engine. Nikki had one. I got into the PS4 gen with the Slim, with like this little guy. So I got in with this little guy, but Nikki had one of these when I met her, and this thing sounded like a freaking jet engine when it would start playing games, and it struggled. And so upgrading from like this to a PS4 Pro was a pretty significant leap, especially because you saw not just a jump from 1080p to 4K checkerboarded, but still it looked way better. And it in some cases sounded better. The PS4 Pro, some of them did also sound like jet engines, but that was mainly a hardware defect. But it still was a much bigger jump, I think, going from this to the PS4 Pro compared to going from the PS5 to like PS5 Pro. It seems like it was not as big of a leap. Which is less exciting. It's harder to justify the money when it's not as big of a leap. So I'm sure that's part of it. Anyway, continuing.
Other more nuanced concerns at play. One of the maddest examples is the recent Unreal Engine showcase featuring The Witcher 4, which was purportedly running on a standard PS5 and at 60 FPS, despite featuring a suite of advanced next-gen lighting and visual effects. Seems far too good to be true, but our friends at Digital Foundry did a big deep dive interview on this, and well, this is that demo running on PS5.
60 FPS on a base console is totally achievable with all the features that we have.
This is a major departure for CD Projekt Red, who've always tended to showcase their new games running in vision on PC. And although they've gone on to clarify that running a vertical slice like this isn't the same as doing it with an entire game, it's still impressive and pretty reassuring for those of us still rocking the older hardware that we might be able to play future games for years to come without going bankrupt. Remember when gameplay trailers...
Well, and I think that it's really crucial, and this was what I took away from the CDPR thing. It was crucial to understand that they were developing with the base PS5 as the starting point, as opposed to starting with a high-end PC and then trying to pull the game down to run on lower-end hardware, which is what happened with Cyberpunk, notably, where they had built it and were developing it for, at the time, very high-end hardware. And then they were like, yeah, when we get to launch, we'll get it ported to PC or to consoles like PS4 and Xbox One and One X, and we'll figure it out at that point. But it just didn't work. Like, it wasn't that easy to get it running on lower end hardware. Whereas this time around, they're doing it the opposite. They're starting with the low end stuff with like the PS5 as the base console, and then they're going to try to scale it up from there for higher end hardware, which is, I think, a much better way of doing it. It also reflects, I think, a broader sentiment within the industry, which is just go where the players are. If there's 75 million PS5s out there and you're making a mass market product like The Witcher 4 will be, Meet them where they are, provide them a great experience on the hardware they currently have. Don't try to build it for something that they don't already have, like a PlayStation 6 or a GPU that doesn't exist yet, which probably will cost $2,000, you know.
Were captured on absolute nonsense spec NASA grade PCs that no mortals could actually afford. On the old VG247 YouTube channel, we still get regular comments on the infamous Watch Dogs E3 2012 gameplay demo that turned out rather infamously to be a 10-minute bullshot. The game didn't look like this. Certainly not on the hairdryers people were playing games on back in 2012. The sheer gulf in visual fidelity between this vertical slice and what people actually ended up playing rightly annoyed a lot of people, and I think it represented the start of a massive shift in what consumers were willing to put up with from games marketing. Ubisoft would go on to take a lot of flack for the state of Assassin's Creed Unity just a couple of years later, a game which promised the true arrival of next gen but could barely run on the platforms it was designed for. Okay, barely run is a bit of an exaggeration. It suffered from a few frame drops and the odd bug, but it was fine. I enjoyed it, and so did millions of others. What I'm doing here...
But I do think that there's been times in games history where like you could get away with graphical downgrades and it was kind of expected. Like Call of Duty, for example, has been doing graphical downgrades from trailers to launch for decades. Rainbow notably had big ones, and that still was tremendously successful. So it's not like a death knell or anything for a game if they have to do graphical downgrades. The point of the Witcher 3 one or Witcher 4 one that I just find very interesting is I'm like, it looks so good, and it is a vertical slice. I really hope they aren't over promising and then under delivering. I really hope, but I'm sure they also are well aware of that too. You know, they I'm sure are all too aware of the risks involved with that.
Is copying to the fact that the media's propensity for sensationalism has a big part to play in stoking these fires too, and we are aware of it, but unfortunately we're trying to please the whims of unknowable algorithms as much as we're trying to serve your needs as consumers, which leads to people like me saying things like Assassin's Creed Unity could barely run on PS4, even though that's bollocks. I reviewed it on PS4 and gave it an enthusiastic 8 out of 10. I got a death threat for that. It wasn't just Ubisoft taking pelters for that sort of thing either. All the way back in 2005, a pre-rendered trailer for Killzone 2 purported to show first-person gameplay, but...
Yeah, you remember this? This thing was mentioned in the Making of Horizon Zero Dawn documentary, because this was basically something they had built as like a sizzle reel of what they wanted to accomplish, but it was not running in real time at all. But then they sent it to somebody, and somebody within Sony marketing misunderstood and thought this was running in real time on a PS3, and they marketed it and published it everywhere, and it was a bit of a problem.
Definitely didn't. It's actually wild looking at this now that anyone thought it was real gameplay, but it speaks to the fact that consumers, gamers, are a lot more savvy about these things than they were back then. And not only that, we're far more concerned about our rights as consumers after decades of being about by every publisher you can think of in every which way they can think of. As much flack as gamers often get from people like me for being misinformed, entitled, angry weirdos, the majority of actual gamers, not the casuals or the outraged tourists, but the kind of people who know when Steam sales are on or when Summer Games Fest is happening, right? The majority of those enthusiast consumers are pretty clued up. I often think that the stories of No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk 2077, both games have been on a long road to redemption after failing utterly to live up to their marketing hype at launch, show that consensus can shift, that gamers do change their perceptions based on new information.
Yeah, the one thing gamers love more than a disaster is a comeback story. It's true. It's very, very hard to pull off, but I do genuinely think that, like, if Suicide Squad had done like major overhauls, they added in another season where they brought in some of the original writers for Arkham Asylum, and they like overhauled tons of it and added single player gameplay modes that were not just looter shooter trash. Like I think if they had really, really worked their asses off to win people over, it could have made a comeback. I think if the same thing is true with a lot of these other games where, like, for example, Battlefront 2 had a major resurgence earlier this year. I think it was back in May. It was right around Star Wars Day, where they made a major comeback with the highest peak player counts in years and years and years. People were going back playing Battlefront 2 for the first time in ages. Really eating it up. It was great. Or what's another one? What's another one that had sort of a comeback? I mean, I'm sure there's plenty, but I think gamers really love to see something that started as a disaster, where the developers listened to the feedback of the fans and then worked their asses off to give them what they needed. Maybe just Battlefield as a franchise is a good example, where going from 2042 to the overwhelming success of Battlefield 6, pretty remarkable. I mean, 2042, again, it's so easy to forget, but it was such a cluster that, like, they literally did not have scoreboards in the game when they launched. They did not have a way for you to pull up a scoreboard to see how many kills and deaths you had. Like, that is so insane as an oversight. It's absolutely outrageous. Absolutely outrageous, but that's what they did. It's just how it worked. So I think gamers very much like to see comebacks, and they will support them when they do see it. But they also love a dumpster fire, and maybe it's the pairing of the two, where it's the dumpster fire leading into the success that they find engaging. I'm not sure.
Through hard work, investment, humility, and honesty, studios and well-known personalities in game development can go from pariah to darling. People were calling Sean Murray the heir to Peter Molyneux. That's a career killer for someone in his position, but he's managed to shake it off. And now No Man's Sky is beloved. Personally, I think the 97 massive updates they've done for it are just polishing a turd, but this isn't about me. The point is this: the enthusiast gaming audience is sophisticated. Stop laughing, I'm being serious. They're sophisticated, media literate.
Well, they're very, what a time to freeze it. They're very informed. And I think that that's one thing that just is so often not discussed enough with some of these discussions around the gaming community, is like back in 2006, 2007, 2008, yeah, people would read like the game magazines, they read Game Informer, they might go on a forum or something, but it was a very different environment to be a gamer than it is today. Today, if you're an active gamer, you probably are watching YouTubers, you probably are watching streamers, you probably are following a bunch of people on X or Instagram or whatever, and you're keeping up with what they say about the industry, and so you're constantly informed on what's going on. And so companies can not really get away with the same things they used to get away with, which is why, like, that example of the Killzone footage, I think is a good one to bring up, because nowadays that would instantaneously be called out and all sorts of people would be very skeptical about it. We'd get a statement from the studio immediately that would go viral. Everybody would know that gameplay footage was not actual gameplay footage. But back in the day, they got away with it because it just wasn't as widespread. Or the misinformation, well, I think that also is a double-edged sword of it, because everybody's so tapped in to the like zeitgeist of the games industry. If a false narrative starts to develop, or even like a just twisted narrative, it can spread very quickly, where it's something where it's like, we're seeing a lot of indications that Microsoft is not focusing on console hardware. Some people start to say they're not going to do a console next generation, and that starts to spread everywhere, and everybody's like, oh, so they're not doing that? Okay, whatever. I think that also is an effect of it too. But in general, I think it's just that people are much more tuned in than they used to be.
And a lot more savvy than the reputation they get from a very loud minority, and we're not going to talk about them. They're not impressed by pre-rendered teasers because they know it has nothing to do with the end product. And if you're going to tell them that it's in-engine footage, real-time capture, genuine gameplay, running on console, no nonsense, you better not be lying about it, because there's a lot of pixel counters out there who will catch you out. And I'm not talking about...
Yeah, I do think Digital Foundry ignited a lot of the interest in like pixel counting and graphics techniques and analysis, so that's certainly a component of it. But I think more than anything, outlets like Digital Foundry have given people the vocabulary to be able to describe what they're saying, or what they're seeing. So when they see something that looks really blurry and like this over reliance on upscalers to hit frame rate targets. Now people have the language and vocabulary to describe that and to be upset about it. Whereas previously, if people didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they're feeling or seeing, they might just be like, I don't know, it just looks off, just looks weird, something's off about it. They couldn't put their finger on it really exactly. But nowadays they do, because again, they're very tuned in. People talk about this stuff much more openly than they used to.
Digital Foundry. I'm talking about random guys on Reddit who've just got nothing better to do. And I think most publishers know this and would rather avoid the hassle of a scandal. Most people who work for big companies aren't rabid C-suite sociopaths in three-piece suits. They're just normal people who frankly don't want the ag. And that's not to say that marketing isn't full of absolute horse, because it is. When a game trailer tells you it's made from in-engine footage, for example, that could mean absolutely anything. It does not have to correspond.
I'm sorry, that was funny.
In-engine footage, for
in-engine footage.
example, that could mean
and engine footage. Sorry, that's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. You got me. That's pretty funny.
absolutely anything. It does not have to correspond
Embedding
whatsoever
cottage.
to the finished product
Unending
as it
sausage.
plays. It could be running in-engine at 1 frame a second and sped up in post. I mean, live-action Star Wars is made in Unreal Engine nowadays. It doesn't mean anything, as a disclaimer. But when a publisher tells you this was captured on PS5, that's a much more meaningful statement. As I've said, if they wanted to show you the game running at its best, they would surely capture on PS5 Pro, as some games are doing. Look at Silent Hill F. Or they would capture on one of those aforementioned PCs they got from Area 51. That's the sort of thing that used to happen. Hell, it still does happen. I used to make game trailers for a living, and I can tell you that even as recently as like 3 years ago when I was last doing it, it was still very common to produce multi-platform trailers from the absolute best capture possible, usually on PC, and just render out a bunch of versions with different mnemonics, different control prompts, etc. I've literally had to sit there and paste Nintendo Switch button prompts over PlayStation derived footage. 9 times out of 10 it's not even nefarious, it's just usually unfeasible to make bespoke trailers for specific platforms. But in that situation, you're hardly going to pick the worst looking version of the thing, right? Usually Nintendo Switch. There's definitely been a shift in attitude recently when it comes to how games are showcased and how that serves an ever more savvy audience. Sensational marketing is and will always be here to stay, of course, but the upshot of all this is that if you've got a PS5, you're probably set for a long time. You're not going to need to fork out for new hardware just to keep up with new releases for a long time yet. And if you consider the fact that generational upgrades are beginning to show real diminishing returns now, because there's only so much detail you can resolve in 4K, because there's only so much time and money studios can spend on graphics, and no, I don't think AI is going to make up the difference in ways that anyone actually likes, because photorealism is a choice and not always the right one, because Moore's Law is dead. Take your pick, man. We're hitting every ceiling imaginable. We're never going to see the kinds of generational leaps we had years ago, like PS1 to PS2 or even PS3 to PS4. But
I think that that's an important thing to just reflect on and bear in mind. A lot of us are frustrated because I remember that moment. It's funny because I wasn't that tuned into gaming at the time, but I remember the first time I saw that GTA 5 trailer. You remember that original GTA 5 trailer? Or maybe like Uncharted 4. This gameplay trailer in 2015 was so graphically insane. People thought it was faked as well. People were like, no way this is real. But it was real. This is what the game actually looked like. If anything, it looked a little bit better when it launched a year later. And that like level of exciting, groundbreaking, just leaps and bounds ahead of where we were previously, that type of thing just doesn't really happen anymore. We see stuff that looks good. We see games with great art direction. We see games with really impressive reflections or whatever, but we just don't see these types of massive leaps anymore. And it's more a reflection of like hardware restrictions and just the realities of tech in 2025. You know, things have just changed. But I think that that's part of the reason people feel so frustrated, is that this level of exciting big leaps, like, they just don't really happen that often anymore, if ever. And so it can feel very frustrating, like we're not, maybe we've gone backwards. It's like, I remember being so excited at E3 whenever they reveal stuff like this, and now I just don't feel that way anymore. But it's just kind of where we are. just kind of how it is, unfortunately. It's the reality of our situation.
As long as I've been alive, gaming is at its worst when people treat it like a tech product. Whether that's suits or punters, we're all guilty of it, and it's at its best when people treat it like a creative art. It is, of course, a bit of both, but I don't need to tell you which side of that equation should work in service of the other, and I also don't need to tell you that the balance has always been wrong. So, does captured on PS5 mean we're in for a long generation? No, and we know that plans are afoot for PS6 anyway, but I suspect we're in for a much longer cross-gen period than we're used to, as the global consumer economy remains firmly in the toilet. By design, frankly, but that's a whole other video. By the time we get to PlayStation 7, it'll be moot, because you'll either be jacking Roblox directly into your spinal cord, or you'll be a plane of sheet glass in an irradiated wasteland, and I can't decide which one of those I prefer, honestly.
Definitely the glass. Yeah, I do think he's absolutely right. The difference, this is so weird, I'm so confused. It's a video on IGN, but it's got a Eurogamer tag on it, and is it a Eurogamer video that they've put up? I don't understand. Yeah, make sure to subscribe to Eurogamer on YouTube, or is this just, why does it say IGN? I don't understand. I don't get it. Anyway, I do think he's right. The next generation, the cross-generational period, I think is going to be massive. This generation, it was pretty extensive, but I think next generation, it's also going to go for like 3 to 4 years at least, because I think that they're braced for people to not spend a whole lot of money on the next gen hardware, at least up front. And as we've seen, they're spending so much money on some of these big games that they're going to want to really double up on it as best they can. The Witcher 4 also probably will be coming out around the same time period as the next generation of consoles, maybe 6 months before or something like that. But there almost certainly will be a cross-generational offering that they're going to bring to it. That's going to be true of a lot of these other games. But I think I do think that we're at a period where a lot of these developers have just accepted that there's not going to be big leaps and bounds forward. So I think a lot of them are developing with like base PS5 in mind. And that's going to be true for the next like 10 years. And a lot of these games are going to be cross-generational. They'll have some extra bells and whistles. They'll have cranked up ray tracing and stuff on the high end, but most of them will be designed with that as the lowest common denominator in mind. And I think also it goes along with what we've seen with Xbox's plans, which is apparently to forego the traditional console approach and instead lean into like a PC centric design philosophy for the next generation of consoles on their end, where everything's going to be built and designed around either modular PCs that Microsoft brands as Xboxes, or maybe it'll be more locked in, but they'll effectively be PCs in terms of system and platform. So I think in terms of development, like if a developer is creating something for PlayStation and Xbox, they're effectively building a PC game in order to get it working on the Xbox, as far as I understand it. So they need to have it be very, very scalable. And so if they just develop with the base PS5 in mind, they could do cross-platform stuff, and they should be good from there. And then they can kind of expand on that and just open up the ceiling from there for the PC ports, for the Xbox port, and everything else that comes after that. It's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting. He took my thing.